Modern science is built on a foundation of quiet, desperate lies that we tell ourselves to keep the lights on and the funding flowing. We enjoy the illusion of progress, pointing at our smartphones and our orbital telescopes as if they prove we have a grasp on the fundamental mechanics of existence. But if you walk into the office of any honest theoretical physicist and look at the whiteboard, you'll find a number that should haunt your sleep. It is a discrepancy so vast, so staggeringly obscene, that renders our entire understanding of the universe a farce. We are currently facing the greatest failure in the history of the human mind, a gap between theory and observation that spans 120 orders of magnitude. This is not a slight miscalculation or a minor glitch in the matrix that can be patched with a new variable or a more sensitive sensor. It is a total, systemic collapse of our ability to describe the world we inhabit, suggesting that the very logic we use to build our reality is fundamentally broken at its core. We find ourselves living in a house divided against itself, where the two pillars of modern thought, general relativity and quantum field theory, refuse to acknowledge each other as existence. On one hand, we have the physics of the very large, which describes a smooth, predictable cosmos governed by gravity. On the other, we have the physics of the very small, a chaotic, vibrating mess of fields and particles. Both theories are the most tested and verified ideas in human history. Yet when we try to use them to calculate the weight of empty space, they produce a result that is wrong by a factor of 10 followed by 120 zeros. To put that in perspective, if you were off by that much when measuring the width of the observable universe, your error would be larger than the size of a single subatomic particle by a margin that defies language. You are currently existing in a reality that, according to our best mathematical models, should have shredded itself into a gravitational singularity a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. The problem begins with the realization that nothing does not actually exist in our universe. We used to think of the vacuum as a cold, empty stage, a silent backdrop where the real actors played out their lives in the form of stars and galaxies. We were wrong, and that error is the first step into the abyss. According to quantum field theory, every point in space is occupied by fields that are constantly vibrating, even at their lowest possible energy state. These are the zero-point fluctuations, the residual hum of a universe that refuses to be still. Even in the deepest reaches of the intergalactic void, far from any star or atom, there's a frantic, high-energy soup of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. This boiling void is not a theoretical abstraction. It is the fundamental texture of the world you see around you. If these fields were ever truly still, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle would be violated, and the entire structure of quantum mechanics would dissolve into nothingness. Every field we know, the electromagnetic field, the Higgs field, the electron field, has a ground state that is not zero. You can think of it as a sea that can never be truly calm, no matter how much you try to dampen the waves. These fluctuations are not just some mathematical ghost. We have measured their physical effects in the laboratory through the Casimir effect, where two uncharged plates are pushed together by the sheer pressure of the vacuum itself. We know the vacuum has teeth, and we know it exerts a tangible force on the world. The nightmare begins when we try to calculate exactly how much energy is contained in those tiny, microscopic shivers of the void. When you add up the energy of all those vibrating fields, the math does not give you a small, manageable number. It gives you a value that suggests the vacuum is the heaviest, most energetic substance in the history of the cosmos. You are walking through a medium that should, by all rights, be denser than the heart of a neutron star. This leads us directly into the wreckage of what we might call the ultraviolet catastrophe 2.0. To find the total energy density of the vacuum, we have to sum up the contributions from every possible frequency of these quantum fluctuations. In a perfect, continuous world, there would be an infinite number of frequencies, leading to an infinite energy density that would make physics impossible. To avoid this, we apply a cutoff at the Planck scale, the smallest possible distance where our current laws of physics still make sense. We assume that below this scale, something new happens that we do not yet understand. But even with this conservative, desperate limit, the result is staggering. The math tells us that every cubic centimeter of empty space should contain 10 to the power of 91 kilograms of energy. This is a number so large it exceeds the mass of the entire observable universe by many orders of magnitude. According to our own equations, a single coffee cup's worth of empty space contains enough energy to boil away every ocean and shatter every galaxy in existence. If this calculation were even remotely accurate, the sheer weight of the vacuum would create a gravitational pull so intense that the universe would have collapsed back on itself before it even had a chance to begin. Space would be so warped, so tightly curled into a microscopic knot, that light could not travel the distance of a single atom. You would not be here to observe this failure, and there would be no stars to light the sky or planets to support life. Yet, here we are, looking out at a universe that is not only surviving, but expanding at a leisurely, almost graceful pace. The discrepancy is not just a mistake. It is a 120 order of magnitude middle finger to our understanding of how gravity interacts with the quantum world. We are forced to confront the fact that our math is predicting a catastrophe that is not happening, which means our math is not just slightly off, it is fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. We are currently living in a reality that our own logic says is a physical impossibility, a ghost in a machine that should have exploded eons ago. The weight of this failure is almost impossible to process because it suggests that we're missing something so large it dwarfs everything we think we know. When we look at the stars, we see a universe that is expanding, driven by a tiny, gentle push that we call dark energy. When we look at the quantum vacuum, we see a violent, high-energy explosion that should have ended everything instantly. The difference between what we see and what we calculate is the largest error ever made by the human species. It is as if we calculated the weight of a grain of sand and found it to be heavier than the entire sun. We try to hide this under the rug of renormalization or fine-tuning, but these are just fancy ways of saying we are guessing in the dark. We are currently standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a gap where our laws of physics simply stop working. We have spent centuries refining our tools, building colliders that span miles and telescopes that look back to the dawn of time, all to find that our most basic assumption about the vacuum is a lie. This is not just about numbers on a page. It's about the fact that the very vacuum you're sitting in right now should be a black hole. Every breath you take is a violation of the laws of physics as we currently write them. We are forced to ask if our laws of physics are actually just a primitive misunderstanding, a set of rules that only work because we're looking at the world through a very narrow, very lucky lens. The vacuum catastrophe is a ticking time bomb at the center of our intellectual history, a reminder that the nothing we take for granted is actually a high-energy monster that we have no idea how to tame. As we move forward, we have to accept that the void is not empty, but filled with a mathematical horror that threatens to undo everything we think we understand about the nature of being. The universe we actually inhabit is suspiciously quiet, a vast and chilling expanse that seems almost indifferent to the mathematical violence brewing in the vacuum. While our quantum equations scream about infinite energy and gravitational collapse, the stars tell a completely different story of calm, measured expansion that defies the frantic predictions of the subatomic world. When astronomers look at the light from distant exploding stars, specifically type 1a supernovae, they do not see a universe being torn apart by the weight of its own empty space or crushed into a singular point of density. Instead, they find a cosmos that is gently drifting apart, pushed by a force so subtle and so weak that it took us nearly a century of modern physics even to notice it was there. This force is what we call the cosmological constant, a tiny numerical value that acts as a repulsive pressure, nudging galaxies away from one another across the dark. It is the actual observed density of the vacuum energy, and it is the only reason you have a stable platform of matter upon which to stand and contemplate your own insignificance in this broken reality. This observed value of dark energy is not a roar. It is a whisper that is barely audible above the background noise of the cosmos, yet it dictates the fate of everything we see. If you were to measure the energy density of the vacuum based on the movement of these distant galaxies, you would find a number so incredibly small that it seems almost like a rounding error in the grand ledger of the universe. It is roughly 10 to the power of negative 29 grams per cubic centimeter, a density so low that it makes the thinnest nebular cloud or the most perfect laboratory vacuum look like solid lead by comparison. This minuscule amount of energy is the Goldilocks value of our existence, providing just enough outward pressure to prevent the universe from collapsing back into a singularity while remaining weak enough to allow gravity to pull gas together into stars and planets. If this number were even slightly larger, the expansion would have been so violent that atoms would never have had the chance to meet, and the sky would be a permanent, featureless void. We are forced to confront the reality that the universe is not the high-energy furnace our quantum theories describe, but a fragile, finely tuned machine that operates on the razor's edge of total dissolution. According to the mathematics of the very small, your body should have been crushed into a point smaller than a single atom before you could even finish your current thought. Yet here you are, experiencing a world that is stable and predictable. This stability is a direct result of the cosmological constant being as small as it is, a fact that stands in direct, insulting contradiction to everything we think we know about the vacuum. We have two separate maps of the same territory, and while one shows a peaceful meadow, the other shows a raging inferno of infinite pressure that should have consumed us eons ago. The terrifying part is that both maps are drawn with the most precise instruments we have ever built, yet they cannot both be true, leaving us in a logical limbo where existence itself is a theoretical crime. The moment of collision occurs when we place these two numbers side by side and realize that the gap between them is the widest chasm in the history of human thought. On one side, we have the quantum prediction of 10 to the power of 120 times the observed density, and on the other, the actual measured value from our telescopes. To call this a discrepancy is to lie to yourself. It is a total, catastrophic failure of the scientific method to reconcile the small with the large. There is no physical analogy in our daily lives that can even begin to capture the scale of being wrong by 120 orders of magnitude. If you were to take a single proton and compare its size to the entire observable universe, you would only be covering about 40 orders of magnitude. To reach the level of the vacuum catastrophe, you would have to repeat that proton-to-universe comparison 3 times over, layering the scale of the entire cosmos into itself again and again until the mind simply refuses to process the magnitude of the mistake. We are not just talking about a big number. We're talking about a scale of error that suggests our mathematics is describing a completely different reality than the one we actually inhabit. If our quantum calculations were a map of the Earth, the error would be so large that the map would suggest the planet is wider than the entire Milky Way galaxy. This is the 120-0 error, a monument to our own ignorance that sits at the center of every physics department in the world. It tells us that when we try to combine the rules of the subatomic world with the rules of gravity, the resulting logic does not just bend, it snaps. We are currently using a set of laws that are off by a factor of a trillion, 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 trillion. It is the most embarrassing prediction ever made, yet it arises naturally from the very theories that give us lasers, nuclear power, and the transistors in your pocket, making our technological success look like a lucky accident. You should, by all accounts of our fundamental theory, be a black hole right now, as should the chair you are sitting on and the air you are breathing. The fact that the vacuum does not weigh as much as the math says it does is the only thing keeping the universe from being a singular, infinitely dense point of nothingness. We are left staring at a gap so vast that it suggests our understanding of space and time is nothing more than a useful fiction, a shallow approximation of a deeper truth we are too primitive to grasp. This is not just a problem for physicists to solve in their spare time. It is a fundamental crisis that calls into question whether the human mind is even capable of perceiving the true nature of the world. We are looking at a universe that should not exist, and the only reason we can even see the mistake is because we are the beneficiaries of this impossible, silent grace that the math refuses to acknowledge. This failure of logic suggests that we are missing a piece of the puzzle so large it occupies nearly the entire frame of our scientific vision. We have spent decades trying to renormalize the math, essentially subtracting one huge number from another huge number and hoping the tiny remainder matches what we see in the sky. It is a desperate, mathematical shell game that feels more like an admission of defeat than a genuine discovery. If the vacuum energy is truly as high as quantum mechanics says, then there must be some unknown force or some hidden symmetry that cancels it out to 120 decimal places. But there is no evidence for such a mechanism, and the more we look, the more it seems that the universe is just wrong by design. We are forced to ask if the very foundation of our logic, the idea that the universe is a coherent, understandable system, is itself a delusion born of our need for order in a chaotic void. The weight of this silence leads us to a final, almost pathetic realization that maybe the universe is not built on elegant logic at all, but on a fluke of cosmic survival. Some scientists have begun to retreat from the math entirely, suggesting that we only see the specific, wrong number, because if the vacuum energy were any other value, there would be no life, no stars, and no eyes to observe the failure. This is the anthropic principle, a scientific surrender that implies we are living in a rounding error simply because the alternatives are all dead, empty universes where gravity won. It is a haunting thought that our existence might not be the result of a grand law, but lucky escape from a mathematical catastrophe that has already claimed every other version of reality. We are standing in the one quiet corner of a house that is otherwise burning to the ground, try to convince ourselves that we understand the architecture while the walls of our logic continue to crumble. The crumbling walls of our logic have led us to a place of intellectual desperation where we no longer seek to explain the universe, but rather to excuse its existence. When the math fails to match reality by a factor of 10 to the power of 120, we do not fix the math. We invent an infinite number of other universes where the math works just as poorly as it does here. This is the multiverse theory, a sprawling, untestable safety net designed to catch us as we fall from the grace of scientific certainty. We tell ourselves that there are 10 to the power of 500 different versions of reality, each with its own accidental setting for the vacuum energy, and we simply happen to be the lucky inhabitants of the one in a trillion fluke where the numbers did not immediately turn us into a gravitational singularity. It is a scientific surrender masquerading as a grand discovery, an admission that we have no idea why our world works and must therefore rely on the blind luck of a cosmic lottery. We have traded the pursuit of fundamental truth for a statistical excuse, hoping that if we multiply our ignorance by infinity, it might eventually look like knowledge. This reliance on the anthropic principle feels like a betrayal of the very reason we began asking questions in the first place. We used to believe that the universe was governed by elegant, universal laws that could be deciphered through reason and observation, but now we are told that our existence is merely a statistical rounding error in a sea of dead cosmos. If the vacuum energy were only a fraction larger, the expansion would have been so violent that stars could never form, leaving behind a cold, dark graveyard of lonely particles. If it were a fraction smaller, the entire system would have snapped back into a point of infinite density before the first atom could even settle into place. You're only here because the most catastrophic error in the history of physics was somehow canceled out to 120 decimal places by a mechanism we cannot see and cannot prove. Every moment of your life is a statistical impossibility that the laws of physics are constantly trying to correct. Yet we treat this miracle as a mundane fact of nature while our equations continue to burn in the background. We are essentially playing a mathematical shell game, hiding our ignorance behind the sheer volume of hypothetical universes we have summoned to save our theories. By claiming that every possible version of the vacuum energy exists somewhere in a vast, sprawling collection of realities, we rob our own universe of its logic and replace it with a roll of the dice. This is not an explanation. It is a retreat into a dark room where we can pretend the light of reason never existed. We are forced to accept that our best equations are not describing a fundamental truth about the nature of being, but are instead just describing the narrow, specific conditions required for a creature like you to exist, and ask why the math is so broken. The vacuum catastrophe remains as a silent, screaming witness to the fact that we are not the masters of the cosmos, but rather the accidental beneficiaries of a glitch in a system that should have destroyed us at the moment of our birth. You are walking through a reality that our own logic says is a physical impossibility, a ghost in a machine that should have exploded eons ago. As we look into this mirror of our own failure, we must confront the possibility that what we call laws of physics are nothing more than local gossip, a set of rules that only apply to our tiny, lucky corner of the void. We are like ants crawling across a single grain of sand on a beach that stretches for billions of miles, trying to deduce the laws of the ocean and the sky by looking at the texture of the quartz beneath our feet. Our perspective is so limited, so hopelessly parochial, that the very idea of a universal law becomes an exercise in human arrogance. The 120 error is not a puzzle that will be solved by a smarter physicist or a more powerful computer. It is the boundary of our species' intelligence, the point where our logic hits a wall and shatters into 1,000 pieces. We're trying to build a structure of understanding on a foundation of shifting sand, and the vacuum energy is the tide that is currently washing the whole building away. This realization brings a cold, intellectual vertigo that makes the solid ground beneath your feet feel like a thin layer of ice over a bottomless ocean. You are walking through a reality that, according to our most successful and verified theories, should be a high-energy monster capable of shredding your atoms into nothingness in a fraction of a second. The empty space in the room with you right now is not a passive stage, but a sleeping predator that has simply chosen to remain quiet for the duration of your brief, impossible life. We have spent centuries trying to tame the nothingness with our equations and our labels, but the vacuum catastrophe proves that the nothing is far more powerful and far more mysterious than we ever dared to imagine. It is the place where our logic goes to die, a silent abyss that stares back at us and laughs at our desperate attempts to find order in a universe that is fundamentally, mathematically insane. Every breath you take is a violation of the laws of physics, as we currently write them, a temporary reprieve from a catastrophe that the math says is already happening. We must finally accept that our understanding of reality is not a grand achievement, but a primitive misunderstanding of a world that does not care about our ability to calculate its density. The gap between the quantum scream and the astronomical whisper is the true face of a universe, a jagged, broken edge that we have tried to smooth over with the language of science. We are the architects of our own confusion, building elaborate models of a world that refuses to follow our rules, and then acting surprised when the math gives us a number that makes existence a crime. The vacuum is the ultimate mirror, reflecting back the limitations of our minds and the fragility of our logic. When you look into the void, you are not looking at an empty space. You are looking at the wreckage of our best ideas, a graveyard of theories that were all too small to contain the true, terrifying scale of the nothingness that surrounds us. Our science has not conquered the dark. It has simply measured the depth of the hole we are falling into. In the end, we are left with a universe that is silent, indifferent, and completely impossible according to the very rules we use to discover it. We have reached the end of the line, the point where the numbers stop making sense, and the philosophy begins to bleed into a kind of scientific nihilism. The 120 error is the final word on our place in the cosmos, a reminder that we are living in a rounding error that has no right to exist. You can try to look away, to return to the comfort of your daily life and your predictable world. But the math will always be there, lurking in the background like a ticking time bomb of logic. The nothingness is not your friend. It is a high-energy catastrophe that has simply forgotten to happen, and we are the ghosts inhabiting the brief silence before the universe finally decides to correct its greatest mistake. We are standing on the edge of the abyss, and all we can do is watch as the last of our certainties vanishes into the dark, leaving us alone with a reality that we will never truly understand. This is the final blow to our collective ego, the realization that the universe does not owe us an explanation, and our math is not the language of the divine. We have spent our history looking for a grand unified theory, a single elegant equation that would tie everything together, only to find a gap so large it defies the very concept of unity. The vacuum catastrophe is the ultimate anti-climax, a story that ends not with a revelation, but with a shrug and a desperate invention of a trillion other failed worlds. We are the survivors of a mathematical massacre, clinging to a tiny, quiet island of stability in a sea of infinite, crushing energy that we cannot even begin to describe. As you sit there, listening to the silence of the room around you, remember that the silence is a lie, a thin veil over a mathematical horror that is waiting for the moment our luck finally runs out. The void is waiting, our logic is already dead, and the nothingness is the only thing that is truly real.